Welcome to Deciphering Growth, the show that explores mental health from every angle. We bring you conversations with personal opinions, stories, and practical tips. We aim to break down the stigma and help you live your best life. So please sit back and let's dive in. Before we begin, we want to remind our listeners that this podcast represents the opinions of Tiffany Graves Eric Stone and the show's guests. The content provided is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Please consult a healthcare professional for any medical questions. The views and opinions expressed are our own and do not represent those of our workplaces. Listening, reading, emailing, or interacting on social media with our content does not establish a doctor-patient relationship.
All right, we are back on this really cold day. And we're gonna break down the body keep score.
Yeah, big disclaimer. I won't say the biggest one we've ever done, but there's some good in this book. There's some not so good in this book. And also, Tiffany and I, at least unless Tiffany snuck that in and since we last recorded, have not published any trauma books. So I'm just gonna acknowledge that we have not written any books. We are not scholars in the field, but we have opinions. So I'm just throwing that out there because um it's probably going to be a little bit of a spicier day today. Um, and I apologize that I have gotten the flu, so my voice is a little annoying, but we are excited to talk about this. So just pretend that I'm a very young therapist, very new Doogie Howser of therapy, and I am here. It's an old reference, which makes sure that people know I'm not Doogie Howser. Okay, Tiffany, anywhere you want to start with this? The body keeps score?
Let's see. I think on my little notebook here, um, that we would talk about the core ideas, some of the research, and how these concepts play out in real life and in therapy.
Yeah, so this is like the prevailing narrative about trauma out there. Like, it's a very widely sold book published in 2014. So 11 years now this book has been out there. Very, very popular just about everywhere. So the author Bessel von der Kolk, big well-known researcher, very influential, and had summarized like so many layers of like how trauma was approached, how trauma's been treated in therapy, in medicine.
Mhm. It is. It is I guess after reading the majority of this book, it's kind of interesting that this is still kind of held onto as like the go-to for trauma.
You think it's still the go-to?
I'm not an expert on if it is or if it isn't. I just know I still hear a lot of people be like, "Oh, it's the best book ever." Like, "Oh, you should totally read this book." Don't know if
See,
that's
I
been
have
your
like
experience
a
or not.
50-50 split amongst my therapy friends who I can't wait that when they listen to this, because honestly, like I can picture it's just a 50-50 side. The 50-50 side being like, hey, we appreciate what this book gives. It does bring some good points. There's some positives. Um, and then the other side being like, it's not a good book. It's not helpful, and there are better options out there. So I lean more that way, especially after rereading it. If it says anything, Tiffany and I have been wanting to have this episode recorded for 2 months, and we could not get through this book. And I
It
think
was a
it would have
hardship.
I'm just telling you all, like, we don't struggle to do the prep. We don't struggle to research or plan or connect or spend the time when we're motivated. So I'm gonna be honest, it was a chore to get through this book from my perspective. But I do know some clients who have read this book and it has been helpful. I've had other clients read this book, it's not been helpful. So again, we're just gonna acknowledge all of the mixed experiences, but um, why don't we start with the positives, Tiffany, or maybe what we see as the benefits, so that way we're not back and forth, because I do want it to have a fair shake, because even though I'm not a fan of the book, I can see some of its value. So, for one, it gives a lot of real stories of patients who have lived with trauma. It does talk about some of the success with treatment, some of the alternative treatments that um, are going on. So again, like that is I think a big positive that there's a lot of real examples. So if you're someone that has not had the chance to explore what's going on with trauma, if you're not someone that has anything to compare anything to, this book would be super helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I will say the chunk or section of the book talking about like how trauma changes the brain and the neurotransmitters and like that brain neurobiology piece can be really insightful, especially if someone doesn't understand like that piece of trauma and how it impacts your brain and your overall development on a neuron level.
Do you think that like do you think it's a good enough that's more your end than mine, Tiffany? Do you think it's a good enough like couple chapters, points made where someone could read that book and kind of have enough of an understanding to know how to approach things?
I this is gonna probably be a sticky situation. I don't know if I think it's the best way to describe it. I think it's an effective way to describe how trauma essentially hijacks the brain's alarm system, and how he talks about like the amygdala, which is like the smoke detector for danger, the prefrontal cortex, which helps us think rationally, and the hippocampus, which organizes memory, and how when someone experiences trauma, the amygdala goes into overdrive and the prefrontal cortex kind of shuts down. I think like his description is easy to grasp, but I don't know if it's like the absolute end all be all way to talk about trauma in the brain.
Okay. What else did you like, Tiffany? So you liked how it discussed neurons. You liked some of the pieces you saw.
Mhm. I think one of the things that to me potentially like reading this if I knew nothing about trauma PTSD is that how individuals with PTSD can be triggered by things that seem random, because their brain struggles to distinguish between the past and the present because their baseline functioning level after trauma is higher than it was previous. So you're essentially having to like relearn your own interactions with your brain and like your own triggers and everything of that nature.
Wow. I do like how it gives a little history of how things have been approached, how things have moved in the field. I do like how it discusses the development of the DSM. I don't think many non-counselors know how some of that works. I like that it talks about some of the different research groups that were going on and how even in the DSM-3 there was a discussion about childhood trauma, and they were seeing back then a link talking to people in the field, the link with trauma and how it is showing up for different disorders. So I do, I'll say more on that later, but that is something I appreciated from the book, is how it ties all that together.
Hmm. Yeah, I do like the overall tying together of concepts for sure.
Anything else you see as the main strength of the book, Tiffany?
Um, let's see. I do appreciate the touching on like the yoga and the movement, the EMDR, the neurofeedback, and like the expressive arts portion of the book. I think it was interesting to see um and hear that like that validation of those different approaches because trauma recovery itself isn't a one size fits all. That for me, I was like, okay, I can give a little credit here for that.
Um, I know you guys are gonna be able to tell where I'm leaning, but the last positive I have when discussing the Body Keep score, is I appreciate how it grabs a lot of information and puts it together. It does talk about different treatment perspectives for PTSD and trauma. Uh, and again, I think I got to check myself. Not everybody has access to that, knows where to go. So if someone's only going to read one book, there is a lot of good initial chunks of information there that could lead someone to the right path. And there is some good pieces there. There's some good there.
Mhm. Well, I don't know if I have any other good
I don't either.
to dote on. So
We did not
what are
talk ahead
some
of
of
time
the
about this as per usual, but I think you guys know where we're headed. So that's the good. We want to appreciate the Body Keep score and the contributions that it's brought. And also, we've got some,
some spiciness?
yes. Um, I think there's just a lot of challenges, and there's just a lot of things. Um, I don't even know where to start. So, Tiffany, I'm gonna maybe throw it back to you of like when we're starting about like biggest concerns, challenges.
Uh, I guess from the get-go, one of the concerns I had was like if someone's reading this today, I mean, isn't aware of like the time when this was written and like what was acceptable, some of the experiments that happened throughout the book, experiments in air quotes here, um, in terms of like interactions between Vander Kolk and his patients and his like residency and all of those experiences. For me, I was like, this is not normal to test out random things on your clients and like write
Yeah.
down research about how it works or how it doesn't work.
I was struck by like how it's this book about being trauma informed, and yet like sometimes it's tough to hear the way clients are discussed. And some of that may just be generational, but like I would not speak about my patients the way that that book
Mhm.
discusses some of their traumatic experiences. And it felt victim blamey at different times. Like there's a story, and I do need to give a trigger warning, like sexual assault trigger warnings. If you don't want to hear that, please just stop like listening like right now. But there's a story of someone who had been sexually assaulted as a child. They go to a teenage group home, they leave. When they leave, they then get sexually assaulted by a group of people. Uh, and like the way it's discussed is like it's blaming this traumatized person for leaving. Like, oh, if only they hadn't left or done this. But it's like, why are we not looking at the system that doesn't support someone in a situation well enough in that scenario? Why are we not looking at the system that allowed this girl to get, like, why are we blaming this? We should be in pain and sad that this happened, not like, well, it's her
Mhm.
fault she left. Like, that just, as someone that used to work in corrections, like, that just doesn't resonate well with me. I think that mindset's very stigmatizing and very, like, wipe our hands of this. Like, well, if only they hadn't left, they would be okay. It's like, I don't like that. I really don't.
Yeah, there were a good amount of sexual assault, uh, domestic violence discussions, that came up where I was like, oh, I don't know if I like even want to read this because it feels so icky. And it did come across in such a way where I was like, this is quote unquote revolutionary. Like the way the way that we're interacting and talking with a traumatized individual right now. Like, um, it was, yeah, it was really hard to read some of those descriptions of interactions with individuals.
Yeah, I think the other piece of just kind of getting at is like it's not very system informed at all. It's very like on the one hand, we talk about like military trauma and different things, but then like we're not talking about like stigma. We're not talking about all these systems and how trauma impacts. So on the one hand, I appreciate it talks about childhood trauma. It talks about some of the concerns and how it links to everything. But then it's like, man, they go a different direction with it. So I think they got to this fork in the road and then be like, well, and that's up to them how they handle it versus like, what about the systems that like carry out these traumas and continue them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that as well. Which reminds me, one of the points, I know it was pretty early on in the book, that I wanted to talk to you more about is how he treated his veterans in terms of like making them like either relive experiences via the groups, via the therapy, and then like making them look at these ink blots and kind of like this weird, I don't know if I want to say, just this weird choice to have them like constantly relive and keep talking about their trauma.
I mean, do you get angry? Like I get angry. Like I'm kind of pissed talking about like I honestly like it's frustrating to like I mean it's a conversation I'm willing to have, but like honestly, before we started recording, I was like, I won't read this book for another 10 years. Like no one's gonna convince me to like, oh, you have to I'm not rereading this book for another 10 years. And by then I'm sure it'll be worse. Like I'm sure it'll be worse.
Yeah, no, I mean there were times when I like, I don't know, between like the way individuals were discussed and the way things were done in the book, I was like, this just feels so icky. Like so icky. And like I would never want a client to like come in and consistently repeat and relive a trauma unless it was something they were like, I want to do this.
Yeah, and I just yeah, it just like it's a fundamental book and I appreciate how it puts things together, but like I just don't understand like and I don't know. Maybe it's just generational difference or perspective difference, but it's like I on the one hand it's so trauma informed, and on the other hand I'm like, how do you get that close to the real clear lens and then like go another I don't know. It's like I felt like we were all on the same page reading the book. I don't know. I felt like I was with them and then like the conclusions of the findings is what I'm not with them on, and that's what I think as we move forward like I think there's a great profound thing in this book about talking about childhood trauma and the link to substance use, and really great point in the book is that if you wanted to do nothing else but to prevent more mental health or addiction, like find ways to prevent childhood trauma. And I'm like, yeah, that's a really great point. um but the ways of managing it, the ways of like what that means and going like, oh, it's just think we just go different directions. And so maybe it's just like if it could have been spelled out um better as well.
Yeah.
Um
What was one of the conclusions that were drawn in the book that you were just like, this is absolutely, I can't be on board with it?
anything else you have is maybe like a big critique?
No, that's totally fine. I asked the question.
Okay.
Give it all.
Oh wait, well you can go ahead. What do you want us to focus on with that question though?
I was just curious as to like what are one of the conclusions in the book where you just felt like maybe it was like the most egregious, I can't be on board conclusion that the book made based on some of the things that were being done. Like from a lens of like this book
Yeah.
is trying to say I'm trauma informed.
I think I've already said it, but it's that one. Yeah, I mean, I don't even want to say her. I mean, there's a name given in the book, like maybe it was I don't even want to say her name. It just feels like really blaming of this person. So there's a scenario in the book that I've already referenced. Like, I can't, I would never feel comfortable if a therapist spoke to a patient of mine like that. I would never feel comfortable speaking to a client of mine like that about their trauma. Um, it seemed very much like there was blame being placed on individual actions. And I just don't know how that was a helpful thought exercise. I don't know how someone is writing a book like this about trauma and then it's
Mhm.
like still. So I think that's my biggest, like, it just like not left the best feeling afterwards of like, okay, well, this is this or this is this. Yeah, I think there was a lack of humanness in discussing some of the cases, and it was just a little like, I don't know, just like that was it. Their traumas and this is it, and that's their stuff, and they make mistakes, and I would not use language like that.
Mhm. Yeah. It sounds like the quote unquote trauma informed presentation they're giving doesn't align with like the trauma informed definition of today.
Yeah, that's my biggest
Mhm. So, like,
disagreement.
for people who have either read the book or consider reading the book, um, how would you, based on like the book's overall definition, how would you define, from the book's lens, what they mean by trauma informed?
From the book lens,
Mhm.
I think they would say looking at factors going on behind the person, like what have they gone through. Um, I think that would be what the book thinks their definition is and what they've talked about throughout is like looking at what are the things that have gone on for that person, what are their experiences, how has that impacted them.
Mhm.
What would you say would be the definition?
Uh, so it's interesting because this book is considered like trauma informed, but there is no like explicit definition in the book of like what that means. Um, but it kind of, I kind of felt like he was just like saying that it is a means through discussion of trauma and its effects on the brain to help you get to a better practicing for healing trauma. It's kind of where I was pulling straws since there is no like real definition for like what trauma informed means specifically. Um, I'm sure other people can read the book and be like, this is the definition I got from it. But I found it very difficult to like actually pull like a trauma informed definition from it.
Yeah, well, I think that's difficult beyond just this book. There is no one set definition like trauma informed. So like you can go online and probably find 7,000 different definitions. There's some overlap, so I think it's about considering the lens of the person. So I I mean, don't know if that's unique to the book is like an issue, but it is ironic that that's a problem in a book that's seeking to come forward and advance the field and
Hmm.
increase how we're taking care of patients.
Yeah, it is interesting. I guess like especially considering like now when I think about being trauma informed and how that means people are actively working to integrate trauma awareness into policies, practice, and interactions to help create a safe, empowering, and healing centered environment versus some of the case studies that were presented in this book didn't feel like that like it aligned with that like current ideation of like what trauma informed means. Like I don't know if I would agree that some of the environments presented in this book are like safe, empowering, or healing centered.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I feel like there's just so many. Yeah, sorry. I'm like, it's hard to talk about. I just don't enjoy this book, and like that is just the general review I would give this book. Like, I did not enjoy it. I did not feel educated. I've read articles, podcasts, other books even. It just I did not feel fulfilled. Like I've had some clients who've even enjoyed the book. It's just it's not an enjoy it's like it's very heavy and I don't think one leaves reading it feeling, ooh. So I think even knowing that we don't like it, it's just this is just a tough to want to go. I just, yeah, it felt like a class I had to take to get my degree or something, where it's like, it's like there's some good stuff there, but I think we've surpassed a lot of it at this
Yeah.
point.
So I was doing some research on the book since it wasn't my favorite book. One thing, actually, a couple things I came across is that there are actually some neuroscientists and psychologists that strongly question the stance on like how trauma is stored in the body. I guess I'm curious, it's like, do you lean a particular way in terms of his views of how trauma is stored, or do you have your own ideas there?
Um, I mean, we've talked about this in the intergenerational trauma episode of like the linkage of like being the egg and your mom within the grandma, like intergenerational
Mhm.
trauma. So I mean, I do think there's an idea about things being stored in the body, and the body knowing. Um, do I think that everything they say is in the book is fully relevant? Um, I don't know. I don't know. I'm probably not the right person to ask that because I'm coming at this with the lean of like I just don't enjoy the book and think there's a lot of um better content. But being trained in some polyvagal theory, I do believe in the mind-body connection and it being stored in the body. So um that's my answer from a polyvagal lens. I do think some of it's true. Do I think he got all the way there? I do not.
Mhm. Yeah. I think it that's one of those weird multifaceted answers, I feel like, in terms of like being stored in the body. Like I think, yes, we have there are biological impacts we carry through life based on the trauma we experience. I guess from my interpretation of the book, I don't agree that we're like storing it like we would like a battery charge. I think it's more of like it has um experiential, biological, and neurobiological impacts that we carry along with us. And it can look different and present differently depending on a person's personal experience.
Hmm. Wow. Anything that kind of sticks out that maybe we've not gotten into
Oh yeah,
today,
I've
Tiffany?
got plenty of
Oh,
little
good.
little
I
tidbits.
want to hear it.
I didn't like the book, so I was like, I'm gonna see if other people are in my boat. One of the other things that I found that a lot of people complain about is Kolk oversimplifies the connection between trauma, the brain, and the body. And he doesn't actually go into detail about like how complex the relations really are. He makes it seem like it's this super simple trauma happens, it impacts the brain, it impacts the body. We can make healing happen. Um, and I mean, even some critics say that like the neuroscience that he presents may not be entirely accurate or fully backed by empirical evidence. Um, don't I'm not like a expert on like neuroscience. I don't have like a degree, but that's some of the critical standpoints that I found when doing some research.
Interesting.
So yeah. The other thing that I found that was really interesting is that in 2018, Kolk was actually fired from his own trauma center due to accusations of workplace mistreatment and abusive leadership.
Oh,
So,
oh,
uh, I don't know if that typically, I don't know if that surprised me based on some of the ways that like some of the interactions in the book were discussed, which I kind of clinically from my professional lens was like, this feels a little bit abusive. Not in the sense of like classical definition of abusive, but it just didn't feel clinically accurate in terms of how you would want to treat a client. But Kind of ironic given his trauma-informed care. And
But like it wasn't that trauma informed. Do you know what I mean? Like if that's trauma informed, then like maybe I do need a book. Do you know what I mean? Like the way he talked is not like it would not hold up. Like truly, like it would not hold up in a trauma informed training. Like this is how you should speak to people, speak about people, from a trauma informed lens.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I just it's like old school, and that's not a compliment. It's just it's like it is such a snapshot of stuff. Like
Mhm. Yeah.
I think
I,
every year it becomes less and less breathtaking and groundbreaking and more dated. Like every year it just is going to become more dated, more out of touch, more like which is anything, but like that book in particular, because we've moved really far since then.
we have a question for you. Like, given the author's personal behavior, like, does that affect the credibility of the book that you read? Like, how would we want individuals to think about this if they haven't read the book and they're considering reading the book because someone told them it was groundbreaking?
Hmm. I think it does. I also just a vibe fit. I just don't like the way that guy writes. It felt very much like I needed to know he was a big deal and like he was groundbreaking. And a lot of the book is like him walking through. You do have to establish credibility as an author. I just have never read a book where someone needed me to know that much what they had done and why they were so important or a big deal. Like that is what I would think is an eighth to a ninth of the book is just him establishing credibility. Doesn't really tie into any of the points, but just, oh, you know, I did this. I was on this subcommittee. We proposed. I mean, truly, like you read it. Like it's like it is a lot of content about I was on this subcommittee. We proposed this. We proposed that. It's like I don't know what. I just yeah. So
Mhm.
I'm gonna say yes because I'm not a fan of them. I'm
Yeah.
just not.
Yeah. Um, I think that's fair. We want to make sure people that haven't read this are aware of like what they potentially are stepping into when they're choosing to read this dated book. Um, so another thing that experts kind of don't particularly like about the book is that it pathologizes, which I'm probably not pronouncing that right. English is hard, guys. Um, trauma responses too much, making it seem like trauma is always a deeply damaging impact in a person's life. Um, Others argue that the resilience and post-traumatic growth are not emphasized enough, leaving readers with the impression that trauma is inescapable. And the book
That's
itself
good.
focuses on extreme cases of PTSD abuse, veteran struggles, and doesn't always acknowledge that people can recover from trauma without severe long-term effects.
It does feel very damning, like, which is ironic because I don't even think that was the point of the book is that if you have trauma, it's damn, but it's like there's not enough to balance out like for the healing. It's a lot of like, oh, um, type of thing. So yeah, I hope to never have to read this book again. I actually can't think of a book that I've enjoyed less reading. It
Don't
would
worry,
be
I will not make you read this ever
truly,
again.
like, I mean, I'm even going, like, I liked what I read in college. I just like it would be I mean, and even high school. Like, I may be the book I have least enjoyed reading, like, in my life. Like, that's a big statement, but I genuinely, like, I can't express how little I enjoyed this book. Like, I just feel like if we clip this, like, I just feel like it's like like book review, like recommend, do not recommend. Like, you want trauma in four pieces? We'll get you some articles on the Patreon or go. It's just I don't like the
Mhm.
way the person writes and talks. It's very patronizing and condescending, and I think very elitist, and that's not how I think I would like spoken to when I'm getting mental health care or any kind of health care. So I just don't recommend.
Yeah,
Don't recommend.
Oh, last thing that kind of I thought was important to note is that I would not encourage any trauma survivor to read this book because it is highly graphic at times,
It is very graphic.
and I can imagine it can be extremely triggering. It does not, I would not say this is a practical book that gives any form of advice for healing. It's more of just an overview of like what Vander Kolk experienced from his personal view of trauma impact on his clients. Is kind of where I view the book. I don't know if I would ever recommend this book to anyone.
Mm. No, and that maybe if I can add to my grievance list, I didn't feel like there were any trigger warnings for topics, so I would be reading, and then it would be like a sexual assault scene, oh, graphic physical violence scene, oh, like neglect, like there is no like I can't think of any time in the book when it's like, oh, hey, um, so yeah, I agree with you. I used to get weird reactions when people were like, "Do you recommend this book to patients?" I'm like, "No." Like, if someone's like, "Well, what do you give someone for EMDR?" I'm like, "The DBT skills workbook." Or if you're like, "Well, where is like the VA's got good read?" Like, I don't do a lot of books, but this is one I'll never. I mean, if you had a positive therapeutic experience with this book, I'm so glad for you. I'm not trying to say it can't help you, but I know where my lane is. I know who I'm working with, and this is just this is not it.
Yeah, like book can be helpful for different audiences, and that's totally fine. But like, I will say that is one of the things that pissed me off the most is when I was sitting down reading slash listening to this book. Absolutely no warnings anywhere on the book whatsoever or anywhere in the Audible version. And just as you mentioned, you would be listening and all of a sudden the one that sticks out for me, and then like if you don't like blood, guts, violence, any of that, please stop listening. Is where they talk about someone their limbs being ripped apart. And I was like, what the fuck is happening? Like, what? How is this just nonchalantly coming up in this book that's supposed to be trauma informed and like helping people understand trauma? And here I feel like I'm being traumatized by reading the book and all these visceral like experiences people have like went through.
Yeah. No, I mean, you make a good point, honestly. Um, yeah, it's funny. It's like, I mean, I always enjoy our episodes. Like this is one I'm like, we just need to do. I was like, I've been so ready to be done with this book, and this I was just like, it's just one that like it's funny. It's like some things you feel passionate about, you want to talk about them. It's just not even that for me. It's like I don't even want to talk about this. Like I just feel like this book is everywhere. It's got so much built-in search engine. It's going to be out there. It's going to get picked up. It's going to go. It's going to keep having impact. And I'm like, I think it'll just continue to be something that comes up for people. But I don't think it's currently oh, everyone's got to read it like it was maybe 5 years ago. I think 5 years ago, like you'd hear about this book all the I think it's slowly becoming less relevant to what people are seeing and working on.
Yeah. Well, I don't have anything left to say about this controversial book. Um, Eric, do you have any last minute tidbits for us?
No, I just want to say, we just want to acknowledge that anyone can be helped by a lot of different things. So we don't want to discourage anyone if you've been helped by this book. We all work with different types of people. And so for us, this is not a book that we would recommend to our patients and not one we would be working from. But so that's, I guess, the last thing I'll throw out if you have anything else.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you. If you've read this book and it's immensely helped you and it did heal you, like that's awesome. That's amazing. Not trying to say this book can't help people depending on, what a certain person needs, but like from our professional lenses, like this isn't something in this day and age, in this current era, that I would consider a trauma-informed, helpful piece of literature. Yeah. That being said, you can follow us on Patreon, Spotify, Facebook. Instagram. We have all the things. Keep an eye out for our newest episodes, and I think next time we're going to be diving into some more trauma, per usual.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Deciphering Growth. We hope you found our conversation helpful and insightful. Subscribe to our podcast for more episodes and check out our Patreon for more content. Don't hesitate to contact us on social media if you have any questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep growing.